Hello and welcome back to the channel NPA Discovery. If you're new here, this is the place where we don't just retell famous stories, we slow them down, examine the details people skip, and pull out the lessons that still matter today. Now, today's story starts with a headline most people think they already understand. On New Year's Day, 1953, Hank Williams was found dead in the back seat of a car. He was 29. Officially, it was a heart-related death. Case closed. Except, it wasn't that simple. Because when you look closely, there are uncomfortable questions about pain, addiction, the machinery of fame, and the kind of medical help that could destroy you faster than your worst habits. There's also reportedly odd physical evidence that, depending on which account you trust, suggests something happened to him before he died that doesn't fit neatly into natural causes. So here's my stance going in. I agree with the title's core idea that Hank's death was not just a tragic accident or a routine medical event, but I also disagree with the temptation to turn it into a pure murder mystery. Hank Williams' final chapter looks less like a single shocking twist, and more like a slow-motion collision between chronic pain, substance dependence, exploitative touring schedules, and questionable medical practices, all happening in an era that didn't have today's guardrails. And that is exactly what makes it so haunting. It's not just a celebrity story. It's a human story. And it's still happening in different forms today. Before we get into the details, do me a quick favor, hit like, share this video with someone who loves music history, and subscribe if you want more deep dive storytelling like this. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more of these long-form episodes. Alright, let's begin where every legend begins, not on a stage, but in a childhood that quietly sets the terms for everything that follows. A boy named Hiram, a body in pain, and a mind full of songs. Hank Williams was born Hiram Williams in rural Alabama in 1923. That name matters, because Hank Williams feels like a myth, a brand, a voice pouring out of an old radio. But Hiram was a kid in the Deep South, raised in a time when hardship wasn't a phase, it was the atmosphere. And from the beginning, Hank carried something most audiences never saw, a spinal condition often described as spina bifida occulta, a birth defect affecting the spinal column. On paper, occulta can sound mild because it's hidden. In real life, it can mean pain, instability, and flare-ups that follow you like a shadow. Here's an uncomfortable truth we rarely say out loud when we talk about legends: sometimes the thing that makes someone extraordinary is also the thing that destroys them. Because when you grow up in pain, you learn coping strategies early. Some are healthy: music, faith, purpose. Some are not: numbing, escaping, anything that lets you forget you're trapped inside your own body. Hank had both. Music wasn't a hobby, it was a home. His mother was involved in church life and music, singing hymns and playing organ. That's not just a cute detail. Church music in the South wasn't background noise. It was community. It was emotional release. It was storytelling. When Hank was still very young, he was given a harmonica. If you've ever watched a child receive an instrument that fits them, you know the look. It's like someone hands them a door and they suddenly realize it opens. But Hank didn't just like music. He needed it. And the difference matters. A lot of kids can sing. A lot of kids can learn chords. But not every kid uses music like a life raft. When fame becomes a furnace, pain, pressure, and the doctor who shouldn't have existed. Welcome back. In part 1, we traced the arc that most people remember: a talented kid from Alabama, a voice that could crack your heart open, a relentless climb toward the national spotlight. But part 2 is where the story stops feeling like a biography and starts feeling like a warning label. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: Hank Williams didn't simply fall from grace. He was pulled by pain, by expectations, by a touring machine that rewards output more than well-being, and by an era of medicine where treatment could look like a cocktail of substances that would terrify modern doctors. And by the time Hank reached the early 1950s, the question wasn't if something would give. The question was what would break first: his career, his body, or his heart. The health spiral, treatment that looks like a trap. As the early 1950s arrived, Hank's issues weren't limited to alcohol. Reports describe attempts at treatment for dependency, brief institutional stays, and repeated returns to the road. And this is where the story becomes more than a personal tragedy, it becomes a systemic one. Because in that era, the boundary between medical care and chemical management could be alarmingly thin. Pain medication, sedatives, stimulants, these weren't always monitored the way they are now. And for a touring musician with money and fame, access could be easier than accountability. If you're dealing with chronic pain and exhaustion, a stimulant feels like a miracle. If you can't sleep, a sedative feels like salvation. If you're hurting, an opioid feels like peace. But mix them, especially without careful oversight, and you're no longer treating symptoms. You're building a storm inside the body. The moment the music stopped. Sometime after midnight on January 1, 1953, the driver realizes Hank is unresponsive. Authorities are contacted. Hank Williams is pronounced dead at age 29. And here is where the story takes its most haunting turn, the aftermath. An autopsy is performed. The reported cause centers on cardiac and related complications, heart failure, hemorrhaging, or similar terminology depending on the retelling. But some accounts describe unusual marks or injuries observed during examination, details that sparked suspicion and speculation about whether there had been a struggle or altercation in the hours before death. Now, it's critical to be responsible here. Anecdotal reports can spread, details can distort, and many mystery claims in celebrity deaths become exaggerated over decades. However, even if you remove the most sensational interpretations, the core remains disturbing. Hank died during a brutal travel push, while sick, likely under the influence of multiple substances, with questionable medical oversight in the background. That is tragedy enough. And it still leaves us with an unsettling question: was this death natural, or was it the predictable result of an environment that treated a human being like a machine? The funeral and the myth becoming permanent. After his death, the public response is enormous. Crowds gather. People mourn not just a singer, but a symbol. And that's another paradox: the moment an artist dies, the world often starts loving them more safely. Because the living artist is complicated. He disappoints. He shows up late. He drinks too much. He argues. He breaks promises. But the dead artist becomes pure story. Pure music. Pure legacy. Hank's funeral becomes a kind of national reckoning. Thousands come to pay respects. Fellow musicians perform. The myth locks into place. And in a way, that's what makes this story so emotionally complex. Hank Williams was celebrated most intensely when he could no longer feel it. The meaning of Hank Williams, why his story still matters in 2026. Now we step back from the timeline and ask the real question: why does Hank Williams still feel so close, even though his life ended in 1953? Because he didn't just sing songs. He sang human weakness, without pretending to be above it. And that kind of honesty doesn't age. Hank's genius was emotional precision. A lot of musicians can impress you technically. Hank's gift was different. He could express emotional truth with terrifying simplicity. It's one thing to write about heartbreak. It's another thing to make strangers feel like you're describing their private memories. That's rare. And it's why his songs survive, because people don't just listen to Hank. They recognize themselves in him. The dark side of relatable, when the artist becomes the container for everyone's pain. There's a price to being that relatable. When the audience hears their own story in your voice, they want more of you. They want you to keep bleeding on schedule. This isn't an accusation. It's a structural reality. In entertainment, we reward the output, not the recovery. And Hank Williams is a case study in what happens when your output becomes your identity. Your identity becomes your income. And your income becomes the reason you can't stop. The medical angle, then versus. Now why his death still feels disturbing. In modern terms, many aspects of Hank's situation look like red flags. Heavy substance use layered with prescription medication, questionable medical oversight by people who may not have been legitimate professionals, a touring schedule that ignored health deterioration, lack of structured treatment and long-term support. Even today, we still see versions of this. The names change. The drugs change. The industries change. But the pattern remains: pain plus pressure plus access plus isolation equals risk. Hank's story keeps resurfacing because it's not a museum artifact. It's a blueprint for tragedy that still exists. A hard question: do we love artists, or do we love what they produce? I want you to sit with this for a second. When an artist is giving us everything, we call it dedication. When they burn out, we call it sad but inevitable. But what if it's not inevitable? What if we've been trained to accept it? Here's a comment prompt I genuinely want to hear from you. Do you think the public has any responsibility in how entertainment treats artists, yes or no? Why? There's no perfect answer. But the conversation matters. Real-life example: the quiet power of stopping before you break. I want to offer a counter-story, because we need one. I once watched a performer mid-level, not a megastar, pause their career at a moment when everything was finally gaining traction. People were confused. Some mocked them. Years later, that performer came back healthier, more stable, and still talented. They said something I'll never forget: I realized I'd rather disappoint strangers than bury myself for their applause. That is not weakness. That is strength. Hank Williams didn't have that option, not easily, not culturally, and perhaps not psychologically. But you do. And that's one of the empowering takeaways of this story: you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to recover. You are allowed to live. The climactic ending: the last ride as a mirror, not a mystery. Now we land this plane in a way that honors Hank, tells the truth, and leaves you stronger, not depressed. Because if we end this story only with death, we miss the point. Hank Williams' final ride is not just a tragedy to gawk at. It's a mirror held up to how we treat pain, how we treat talent, how we treat human limits, and how easily we can confuse productivity with purpose. Here's the climactic truth: Hank Williams was not destroyed by one moment. He was eroded by a system that treated his survival as optional, a system that needed him to sing, even when his body was begging him to stop. A system where relief came in bottles and syringes instead of rest and healing. A system where legend was easier to celebrate than man. And yet, listen closely, Hank still left something stronger than the machine that consumed him. He left songs that made people feel less alone. He left a voice that carried the trembling truth of being human. He left proof that art can outlive suffering. But here's the line I want to end on, because it's the only ending that turns grief into power: we don't honor Hank Williams by romanticizing his pain. We honor him by refusing to demand pain from the next person. If you are an artist watching this, you do not have to bleed to be brilliant. If you are someone living with chronic pain, you deserve real care, not just coping. If you are someone chasing success, success is not worth your body, your mind, or your life. And if you are a fan of Hank, of any artist, here is the most respectful form of love: love the work, yes, but also advocate for the worker. Because legends are not born from suffering. Legends are born from truth spoken through a human throat that still deserves to breathe tomorrow. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening the long way. And remember, the best tribute to any artist is not a candle after they're gone, it's a culture that lets them live while they're still here.